Welcome to another episode. As always, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. The comments are a wonderful place to share that. It makes this feel like a circle of people scattered across the world, listening together. And if you find comfort in these quiet explorations, consider subscribing, so you'll have a place to return whenever you want to drift, reflect, and listen. Tonight, we're going to explore something that doesn't demand attention, yet quietly shapes so much of life. It's tucked away in pens and mattresses, it ticks inside watches, it steadies bridges and cushions footsteps. A rule so simple it fits into a single line. As the extension, so the force. Hooke's law, the law of the spring. Behind those words lies a force both practical and poetic, a hidden balance between tension and release, resilience and rest. It's one of the quiet foundations of the modern world. And tonight, we'll follow it gently through history, science, invention, and thought to see how something so small and unassuming holds together so much. So settle in, let the sound carry you, and let's begin with the quiet power of springs. If you take a moment to look around, you may not see them, but springs are everywhere. They're in the pen resting on your desk, tucked quietly into the click mechanism that makes the tip appear and vanish. They're coiled inside your mattress, carrying the weight of your sleep night after night. They're beneath the seat of your car, absorbing bumps in the road so you hardly feel them. They live in watches, ticking away seconds with silent precision. They are so ordinary, so ubiquitous, that we rarely pause to notice them. Yet without them, the rhythm of modern life would be jarringly different. There is something paradoxical about springs. On the surface, they're nothing special, a piece of coiled wire or even a bent strip of metal. Nothing about them looks particularly powerful. And yet that humble spiral embodies a principle that underpins machines, comfort, measurement, and even the way we tell time. Springs are an unseen force, shaping the world not with spectacle, but with consistency. The magic of springs begins with a deceptively simple law. In 1676, Robert Hooke, one of the great but often overlooked minds of the scientific revolution, wrote down a phrase in Latin, ut tensio sic vis. Translated, it means, as the extension, so the force. Or more plainly, the further you stretch a spring, the harder it pulls back. Stretch it twice as far, and the force doubles. Push it in, and it resists with equal faithfulness. This simple proportionality is known today as Hooke's law. What makes Hooke's law so profound is not that it's mathematically complicated. In fact, it's startlingly simple, but that it captures a universal truth about the way matter behaves under strain. Most solid materials, within a certain range, obey this rule of proportionality. Pull them, and they resist. Compress them, and they push back. Springs simply make this principle visible, tangible, and useful. This is why they have become silent companions in our lives. Springs are trustworthy. They don't rebel or act unpredictably. They store energy and then return it with a quiet, reliable grace. That reliability is what allows springs to be hidden inside objects that must never fail. The mechanism of a clock, the suspension of a bridge, the needle of a seismograph recording distant tremors. You may never see them at work, but you depend on them constantly. Think about the mattress beneath you, if you are lying down now. The springs inside respond instantly to your weight, yielding just enough to cradle you and pushing back enough to hold you up. Each coil is a little sculptor of comfort, balancing force and rest. Or picture the suspension system in a car, those steel coils turning a jolting, bone-rattling ride into a smooth glide over uneven ground. Without springs, a short drive down a bumpy road would feel like being hurled around a medieval cart. Even the small details of daily life rely on these coils. Every time you click a pen, there is a miniature orchestra of forces, your thumb pressing down, the spring compressing, then releasing with enough energy to shift the mechanism. You don't think about it, but without the spring, the pen would not remember its two positions. The spring is its memory. Clocks tell an even more poetic story. Before electronics, before batteries, time was measured by tension wound into springs. A coiled hairspring in a watch is almost invisible to the naked eye, but it vibrates with extraordinary regularity, pacing out seconds with the discipline of a soldier on parade. In that small, nearly invisible spiral, human beings found a way to carry time in their pocket, to cross oceans, to navigate the globe. All from Hooke's principle: as the extension, so the force. The beauty of Hooke's law is its universality. It applies to the spring in your mattress, the suspension in your car, and the steel cables of a skyscraper swaying gently in the wind. It is one of those fundamental truths that quietly holds the world together. And yet, like so many everyday miracles, we rarely notice it. We take springs for granted precisely because they work so well. A spring is rarely the star of the show. It is hidden inside mechanisms, doing its work without fuss, reliable to the point of invisibility. Perhaps that's why Hooke himself wrote his law in the form of a puzzle, an anagram, when he first revealed it. He wanted to ensure that no one else would steal credit, but there is something fitting about the way his discovery was hidden at first, just as springs themselves are hidden, folded into the inner lives of objects. If you listen closely, though, you can feel the world bouncing softly on springs. Every time you walk across a suspension bridge, every time a train car glides along rails, every time a skyscraper sways but does not topple in the wind, you are watching Hooke's law at work. It is the law of resilience. Things bend, but they do not break. This raises a fascinating thought. The spring is not just a piece of hardware. It's a metaphor. To live is to be stretched and compressed by circumstances, and yet to return, to recover, to find balance again. A good spring is one that endures repeated stress without permanent deformation. In a way, that's resilience in its purest form. Humans admire resilience because we instinctively know it's what keeps us standing when life applies its forces. We stretch, we yield, but we return to form. Of course, there are limits. Stretch a spring too far and it will deform permanently, no longer obeying Hooke's neat proportionality. Materials have their breaking points, so do people. But within the safe zone, the range where elasticity holds, Hooke's law is absolute. It is the quiet law of balance. There's also a subtle elegance in the way springs store energy. When you stretch a spring, you are putting energy into it. That energy doesn't vanish. It waits, coiled inside, until the spring is allowed to release it. That's why a mechanical clock can run for hours on a single winding. You twist the mainspring, storing energy, and then it slowly, gently unwinds, giving it back at a controlled pace. There is something poetic about that. The human hand winding time itself into a spiral of steel. If we think of energy as life's currency, then springs are little banks, holding energy safely and returning it faithfully when needed. They are trustworthy treasurers of motion. And what makes them truly remarkable is how little they demand in return. They do not need fuel, electricity, or complex care. A spring only asks to be made of good material, coiled with precision, and not pushed beyond its limits. In exchange, it will serve loyally for years, even centuries. The unseen force of springs is, in the end, a story of trust. We trust our chairs to support us because of the springs inside them. We trust our cars to glide safely because of the coils beneath. We trust our watches to keep time because of the hairspring's heartbeat. And we trust Hooke's law itself, because again and again, nature confirms it. So as you listen tonight, perhaps notice the small mechanisms around you. That pen on your desk, that mattress beneath you, the subtle bounce of a floorboard. All of them are tiny whispers of a universal law, quietly at work. As the extension, so the force. A simple phrase, a quiet power, and it is only the beginning of the story. When we speak of Robert Hooke, we are speaking of a man who was both indispensable and, in many ways, invisible. He lived in the 17th century during one of history's great upheavals, the scientific revolution. Europe was shaking off centuries of medieval thought, turning instead to experiment, measurement, and the language of mathematics. It was an age of discovery, but also of rivalry. Hooke's story is both a triumph of scientific insight and a cautionary tale of how memory can be shaped by conflict and politics. Robert Hooke was born in 1635 on the Isle of Wight, a sickly child with uncertain prospects. His father was a clergyman, and Robert was not expected to live long or achieve much. Yet, his restless mind and nimble hands soon revealed a gift for observation and invention. He tinkered endlessly, building mechanical toys, clocks, and even miniature drawings. His artistic talent was as keen as his scientific one. Later in life, these two sides, the artist and the scientist, would merge in Micrographia, his famous book of drawings made with a microscope, which introduced readers to the astonishing hidden world of fleas, cells, and plant fibers. Hooke's timing was extraordinary. He came of age just as the Royal Society was being formed in London, a gathering of natural philosophers determined to advance knowledge through experiment and observation. The Society's motto was nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it. It was a call to test and prove, not merely to accept authority. Hooke was appointed the Society's first curator of experiments. His role? To devise demonstrations, experiments, and devices week after week, essentially supplying a constant stream of wonder to keep the Society alive. This was both an honor and a burden. It meant Hooke's days were filled with invention, measurement, and proof. And it was in this fertile ground that Hooke began to think about springs. Imagine the London of the 1660s. The city was rebuilding after the Great Fire of 1666. Scientific minds were alight with possibilities. Telescopes peering into the heavens, microscopes into the tiny barometers measuring air pressure, pendulums keeping time. For Hooke, who had his hands in almost everything, architecture, mechanics, astronomy, chemistry, the problem of elasticity was one more puzzle to solve. The behavior of springs had, of course, been noticed long before Hooke. Bows, for instance, are nothing more than a curved elastic device storing energy and releasing it as an arrow flies. But what Hooke did was capture the principle in mathematical clarity. He noticed that when you hang weights from a spring, the extension is proportional to the load. Double the weight, double the extension. The relationship is linear, predictable, and elegant. In 1676, Hooke decided to publish his discovery, but with a twist. He wrote it as an anagram, CIINOSSSTTUV. To the untrained eye, it looked like nonsense, but it was his way of establishing priority without revealing the secret outright. Anyone could claim an idea, but by publishing a coded version, Hooke could later unveil the solution and prove it had been his all along. The decoded message was the Latin phrase ut tensio sic vis. As the extension, so the force. Why hide such a law in a puzzle? Partly because Hooke was wary. In the intense atmosphere of the Royal Society, credit was fiercely contested. Scientific discoveries were not just curiosities. They were reputations, livelihoods, even national pride. To be first mattered. Hooke, who often felt overlooked or overshadowed, took extra care to secure his place. The anagram was a clever insurance policy. When Hooke later revealed the meaning, the simplicity of the law astonished many. It was not just about springs. It was about the very nature of elasticity. Whether you were bending a piece of wood, stretching a metal wire, or compressing a coil, the principle held: deformation is proportional to force. at least within a certain range. The law became a cornerstone of mechanics and engineering. The implications were vast. Hooke's law allowed for the design of predictable instruments. Springs could now be trusted to behave consistently, which meant they could be used in measuring devices like balances, seismographs, and barometers. It allowed timekeepers to miniaturize and refine clocks, because the hairspring inside a watch was governed by this precise proportionality. It allowed engineers to calculate stresses and strains in beams, arches, and bridges. In short, it gave humanity a reliable rule for working with the elasticity of matter. But Hooke's life was not as tidy as his law. He was brilliant, but also prickly. He argued fiercely with rivals. His greatest and most bitter conflict was with Isaac Newton. Hooke had made important observations about the inverse square law of gravity, the idea that the force of attraction decreases with the square of the distance. Newton would later take that idea, combine it with his own genius for mathematics, and formulate the law of universal gravitation. Newton acknowledged that others had suggested the principle, but his equations made it unassailable. Hooke, however, claimed that Newton had stolen credit, and their rivalry became legendary. When Newton rose to power as president of the Royal Society in 1703, Hooke's legacy suffered. Newton, who had a long memory and little mercy for those who opposed him, allowed Hooke's name to fade. No portrait of Hooke survives, possibly because Newton may have suppressed or destroyed them. Today, when people hear the name Newton, they think of gravity, calculus, and apples falling from trees. When they hear Hooke, if they hear him at all, it is usually in connection with a single law about springs. Yet Hooke contributed to optics, microscopy, astronomy, architecture, and even the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire. He was, in truth, one of the great polymaths of his age. This shadowing of Hooke by Newton is a poignant reminder that history is not always fair. Hooke was perhaps less charming, less politically adept, and less careful with his allies than Newton. He could be quarrelsome, quick to take offense, but his mind was ceaselessly inventive. His notebooks brim with sketches of ideas, flying machines, diving bells, universal joints, even designs resembling early telegraphs. He once proposed that light was a wave, a concept that would only be vindicated centuries later. And yet, because he clashed with Newton, his reputation became muted, his contributions reduced in the popular imagination. Still, Hooke's law endures. That simple phrase, as the extension, so the force, is now taught to schoolchildren. Engineers apply it in calculations every day. It remains the most enduring monument to his genius. And there is something fitting in that too. Springs are invisible, yet essential, quiet but powerful. Hooke's law is much the same. Though Hooke the man was overshadowed, his principle endures in countless hidden places, quietly sustaining the world. If you pause to reflect, there is a philosophical beauty here. A man who felt overlooked gave the world a law about forces that are themselves overlooked. Springs hide inside mattresses, pens, and watches. Hooke's name hides behind Newton's, yet both are indispensable. Perhaps there is a lesson about humility in this, that greatness need not always stand in the spotlight. Sometimes it coils itself in the background, waiting, resilient, eternal. Hooke died in 1703, the same year Newton became president of the Royal Society. His passing marked the end of an era and the beginning of Newton's dominance. But if Hooke could see our world today, he would find his law at work everywhere, in skyscrapers swaying safely in the wind, in seismographs recording the Earth's tremors, in satellites unfolding delicate instruments in space. He might smile to know that while portraits of him may be lost, his principle lives on in every spring. And so, the birth of Hooke's law was not just the unveiling of a scientific relationship, It was the story of a man who saw order in elasticity, who trusted that nature could be described with elegance, and who left us a truth that outlasted rivalry, outlasted neglect, and outlasted his own fragile life. Ut tensio sic vis. As the extension, so the force. The quiet whisper of resilience, discovered in the tumult of an age, still holding us today. Before springs found their way into pens and mattresses, they transformed something far more abstract, the very way we measure time. The march of hours and minutes, once tied to the swing of heavy pendulums, became something that could be tucked inside a pocket, carried across oceans, and held close to the body. It is here, in the quiet coils of a spring, that time itself found a heartbeat. In the middle of the 17th century, people were just beginning to learn what it meant to keep time with true precision. Before then, the most reliable instrument was the pendulum clock, created in 1656 by the Dutch scientist Christian Huygens. Its invention was a marvel. By harnessing the steady gravitational swing of a pendulum, Huygens built a clock that could lose less than a minute a day, astonishing for an era accustomed to water clocks, sundials, and sand glasses. But pendulums had their limits. They needed stability, an anchored position, a quiet room. You could not take a pendulum clock to sea. You could not tuck it into a bag and carry it with you. The pendulum demanded stillness. What people longed for was time that could travel. Portable timekeeping was the key to something even larger: global navigation. At sea, latitude could be found easily by the stars, but longitude, the measure of how far east or west you had gone, was treacherously difficult. Without accurate time, ships drifted unknowingly off course. Entire fleets could be lost, fortunes swallowed by storms because no one could measure longitude. To solve that problem required a timekeeper that could endure motion, salt air, storms, and months on deck. In 1675, Huygens returned with another idea, one that drew directly upon Hooke's law. He introduced the balance spring, also called the hairspring, a tiny spiral of metal attached to a wheel inside a watch. The principle was deceptively simple. As the wheel rotated, the spring wound and unwound, providing a restoring force. Each oscillation of the balance wheel was now regular, independent of the jostling of a ship or the tilt of a wrist. In miniature form, Hooke's law was alive. As the extension, so the force. The hairspring transformed the watch from a curious accessory into a precision tool. Suddenly, time became portable. A sailor could carry it across oceans, a merchant could consult it at dawn in a caravan, an astronomer could use it at the telescope. The tiny coil turned a watch into a companion that measured the world not by sun or pendulum, but by the steady resilience of a spring. It is hard today to grasp just how enormous the stakes were. In the age of exploration, the difference between accurate and inaccurate time was the difference between empire and ruin. A ship setting out from England or Holland to the Indies carried not only goods, but also political power. Getting lost at sea was not a minor inconvenience. It was a catastrophe of lives, wealth, and ambition. The spring solved a puzzle that had haunted sailors for centuries. By carrying a reliable timepiece, a navigator could compare the local noon, the moment the sun reached its highest point overhead, with the time on the watch, which remained set to a home port like London. The difference told him how far east or west he had travelled. This was not just an improvement in navigation, it was the opening of the global age. The spring, coiled invisibly inside a watch, was in some sense as responsible for the expansion of trade and empire as sails or cannons. It made the oceans navigable with confidence. The 18th century became the theatre of one of the great engineering dramas of all time, the quest for the marine chronometer. John Harrison, a carpenter from Yorkshire, spent his life chasing the dream of a clock that could keep perfect time at sea. Pendulums were useless on a rolling ship, So Harrison turned to springs, balances, and ingenious mechanisms to tame temperature changes and friction. His fourth model, the H4, looked more like a large pocket watch than a clock. In 1761, it sailed to Jamaica and back, losing only 5 seconds over 81 days. It was a triumph beyond imagining, a solution to the longitude problem, and a reminder that springs, simple, silent springs, were the key to mastering the globe. But there is something more intimate in this story too. Think of the balance spring itself, a strip of metal wound tightly into a coil, thinner than a strand of hair. It pulses hundreds of times each minute over and over for years, sometimes decades, without failing. Though it is made of steel, it resembles life, a heartbeat in miniature, a rhythm you can almost hear if you hold the watch to your ear. Each tick is the whisper of Hooke's law in action, carving seconds into order. For centuries, this heartbeat was the sound of human progress. It measured railway timetables, synchronized factory shifts, governed armies on the march. It allowed science to reach deeper, measuring chemical reactions to the second, coordinating telescopes across continents. The spring became a kind of global metronome. To wind a watch was to wind civilization itself. The spread of spring-driven watches changed daily life as well. By the 18th century, pocket watches became symbols of punctuality and status. To carry one was to show not just wealth, but discipline. It meant your time was your own, organized and precise. By the 19th century, watches had become accessible to the working class. Railroad conductors relied on them, factory workers checked them, generals timed maneuvers with them. Time was no longer an external force told by church bells or tower clocks. It was internal, personal, resting against the chest. The 20th century shifted that intimacy once more. Wristwatches emerged during World War I, born of necessity. Soldiers could not fumble with pocket watches in the trenches, so they strapped them to their wrists. What began as a battlefield adaptation soon became fashionable. Once again, springs made it possible. Inside each case, a mainspring coiled tightly to store energy, and a balance spring unwound steadily, releasing it in measured rhythm. The principle had not changed since Huygens, but the context had. Now, timekeeping was woven directly onto the body. Even today, when quartz crystals and atomic oscillators define the official standards of time, mechanical watches remain prized. Not because they are the most accurate, in truth, they lag behind a cheap digital watch, but because they embody something deeply human. Inside them, you can see and hear the old poetry of springs. The mainspring wins and waits, a bank of energy. The balance spring ticks with lifelike regularity. The escapement clicks in partnership, transforming stored tension into measured release. Hundreds of tiny parts, assembled by skilled hands, turn steel and jewel into an instrument of astonishing elegance. Modern watchmakers, from the ateliers of Switzerland to small workshops elsewhere, still treat the hairspring as the soul of the watch. Alloys have been improved, made resistant to temperature changes, magnetism, and fatigue. Silicon is now used in cutting-edge designs for greater stability. Yet the principle remains unchanged. The spring resists proportionally to its stretch. Hooke's law, 3.5 centuries old, still defines the heartbeat of the world's most intricate timepieces. There is almost a spiritual thread running through this continuity. A craftsman in the late 17th century, peering by candlelight as he coiled a hairspring, would recognize the same principle guiding a 21st century artisan adjusting a silicon balance spring under a microscope. The tools have changed, the materials have changed, but the law remains eternal. Across centuries, across revolutions of technology and society, the spring has held time steady for us. Perhaps there is something humbling in that. Today, satellites beam signals from atomic clocks, and our smartphones know the time more accurately than the greatest chronometers of the past. But the old watches still beat, still tick, still whisper the passage of seconds with a mechanical soul. They remind us that progress is not only measured in leaps forward, but also in the endurance of simple truths. A spring does not need electricity or programming. It only needs to be wound, to obey its nature, to do what Hooke promised, to push back in proportion, to oscillate faithfully. If you happen to wear a mechanical watch, or if one sits in a drawer at home, pause for a moment, wind it gently, hold it to your ear. The faint tick you hear is not just a sound, it is centuries of invention, centuries of sailors crossing oceans, of factories whirring, of trains departing on time. It is the sound of civilization finding rhythm. It is the voice of a spring, coiled tightly and yet yielding gracefully, translating energy into time. And when you think of it that way, every second measured is not just a unit of duration, but a gift. Springs have given humanity the ability to share time across continents, to connect moments across distance. They have made time portable, personal, reliable. A simple coil of metal, obeying a simple law, has reshaped the way humans live together. The world ticks because springs do, and in every tick we hear the quiet power of Hooke's law, guiding us, heartbeat by heartbeat, through history. If timekeeping gave springs a role in the grand sweep of history, the everyday world gave them something even more intimate, the power to cradle, to cushion, to soften the hard edges of existence. It is one thing to make the stars navigable and the oceans crossable. It is another to make sleep more comfortable, a chair more forgiving, or a pen more satisfying to click. In these quieter roles, springs became companions not of empires and discoveries, but of bodies, backs, and beds. Consider the bed. For most of history, sleeping arrangements were austere. Straw stuffed into sacks, feathers gathered into ticking, or rough wooden frames offered limited comfort. The softness depended on material, not mechanics. That changed in the 19th century, when the idea of inserting springs into mattresses began to spread. The first patent for a spring mattress was filed in 1865 by Heinrich Westphal, a German inventor who likely had no idea that his coils would become a global standard. Inside the mattress, metal springs worked together to distribute weight evenly, adjusting dynamically to the sleeper's movements. Each coil bent just enough to give way, but then pushed back in proportion. Hooke's law, once again, tucked beneath the sheets. It may seem trivial compared to sea clocks or seismographs, but the spring mattress was revolutionary in its own way. Suddenly, the human body could rest on a surface that wasn't just passively soft, but actively responsive. It was not simply about luxury, it was about health, about waking without aching, about giving spines and joints the support they needed. The spring mattress quietly improved millions of lives in the most private of spaces. It's a reminder that progress does not always arrive in laboratories or observatories. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet moment when someone stretches out and says, almost unconsciously, "This feels better." Chairs and sofas followed a similar path. Before springs, upholstery meant padding alone, horsehair, feathers, or wool stuffed into fabric. These materials provided softness, but not bounce. Sit in an early wooden chair and you feel its honesty immediately. It will hold you, but it will not yield. By the 19th century, coiled springs were being sewn into upholstery, transforming furniture into something resilient, something that gave way before it resisted. A Victorian could now sink into an armchair that embraced them like a cushion of air, rather than a sack of stuffing. The spring allowed furniture to balance comfort and durability. Automobiles took this even further. The suspension systems that made cars tolerable and eventually pleasurable to ride in were dominated by springs. The earliest vehicles borrowed leaf springs from horse-drawn carriages, long strips of steel layered together, flexing to absorb shocks. Later, coil springs became standard, compressing and expanding as the wheels met bumps and potholes. Without them, every ride would be a jarring experience. Bones rattled, teeth clenched. Springs turned the brutal clatter of early roads into something manageable, opening the door to travel not just as endurance, but as enjoyment. In a sense, springs civilized motion. They absorbed violence and returned calm. Even today, in the sleekest of modern cars, the basic principle is unchanged. Wheels bounce, springs absorb, passengers relax. Springs also made their way into smaller, subtler places. The ballpoint pen, an invention of the 20th century, owes part of its satisfying click to a coil spring inside. It is almost comical, the way people play with pens, clicking them open and shut absent-mindedly during meetings. That behavior, so widespread it has become a cliché of distraction, is really a celebration of the spring. We enjoy it because springs respond. They don't collapse permanently. They don't resist stubbornly. They yield, then push back, like a tiny conversation between finger and mechanism. It is almost as though the spring is saying, "I'll give way for you, but only on the condition that I return." There is a playful side to springs too. Trampolines, for example, are pure spring-powered joy. First designed in the 1930s, they rely on coiled steel to amplify the human bounce. Each jump stretches dozens of springs, which then snap back in unison, propelling the jumper higher than they could ever leap on their own. It is Hooke's law turned into laughter, children soaring into the air, trusting completely that the springs will catch and return them. Few scientific principles are so enthusiastically celebrated in suburban backyards. Even toys, without obvious coils, often hide springs. The classic wind-up car, for instance, is powered by a coiled strip of metal that stores energy as you twist a key. Release it, and the spring unwinds, spinning gears that send the toy scuttling forward. Jack-in-the-boxes, pinball machines, pogo sticks all rely on springs. To a child, the world of springs is not about proportional forces and elastic limits. It is about surprise, delight, the sudden buoying that makes an object feel alive. If you step back, it becomes clear that comfort and play in the modern world have been inseparable from springiness. There is something deeply human about trusting the bounce. We are instinctively suspicious of what is rigid. A rigid chair bruises. A rigid bed leaves us sore. A rigid toy is dull. But a spring reassures us that force will be met not with resistance, but with forgiveness. We lean in, and it pushes back gently, as if acknowledging our presence without rejecting it. That trust has shaped productivity as much as comfort. Imagine factory workers standing on hard floors for 12 hours. The introduction of spring-supported flooring and cushioned seating changed endurance. Office workers, too, rely unconsciously on the resilience of chair springs to survive long days at desks. Even something as prosaic as the shock-absorbing sole of a shoe often contains tiny, spring-like structures, easing the impact of each step. The spring became a hidden collaborator in human efficiency, making labor more tolerable, rest more restorative. There is perhaps a small irony in how we anthropomorphize springs. We describe people as springy when they are energetic, resilient when they bounce back from adversity. We trust athletes with spring in their step. We even describe optimism as a kind of elasticity, the ability to rebound from setbacks. Springs, though inanimate, have become metaphors for precisely the qualities we admire in living beings. We don't celebrate rigidity in people. We celebrate flexibility, recovery, and poise under stress. Springs embody that. They remind us that life is not about being unyielding, but about yielding wisely and then returning with strength. It is worth noting that springs also taught us about limits. A mattress spring can compress only so far before it deforms. A car suspension can absorb only so much before bottoming out. A trampoline can launch only so high before the metal strains. Springs remind us that resilience is not infinite. There is always a range within which proportionality holds. Stretch beyond it, and the spring will warp, break, or fail. Humans, too, live within such bounds. We are elastic, but not unbreakable. Recognizing that limit is part of wisdom. Still, within those limits, springs gave us not just function, but pleasure. The bounce of a bed, the smoothness of a ride, the click of a pen, the laughter on a trampoline, these are not trivial. They are the texture of daily life, made gentler by steel coils. Comfort is not a luxury. It is part of what allows bodies to work, minds to think, and spirits to rest. Springs carried Hooke's law from the laboratory into the bedroom, the office, the playground. They wove elasticity into the fabric of living. If you take stock of your surroundings, you might realize how many small comforts depend on them. The office chair beneath you, the sofa in your living room, the mattress awaiting you tonight, all bear the quiet fingerprints of Hooke's discovery. You might even catch yourself smiling at the thought that the satisfying click of your pen is, in fact, 17th century physics in miniature. Springs are humbling that way. They remind us that progress doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, hidden inside a cushion, a car seat, or a child's toy. Sometimes the most transformative technologies aren't the ones that conquer oceans or split atoms, but the ones that make us sleep better, sit longer, and laugh harder. And perhaps that is why we instinctively trust something springy. It is not just comfort, it is reassurance. A spring promises that the world can give way without collapsing, absorb force without breaking, bend without losing form. It is a promise we accept gladly, whether we are drifting to sleep on a mattress, bouncing on a trampoline, or simply clicking a pen while our thoughts wander. If springs brought comfort to our beds and rhythm to our watches, they also brought something subtler, but perhaps even more profound, a way to make the invisible visible. In the world of science, many of the most important forces cannot be seen directly. Gravity has no color, pressure leaves no mark, vibrations move through the ground unnoticed until they cause devastation. To study these mysteries, we need instruments that can translate hidden forces into something measurable. Again and again, the translator has been the spring. Think of the earthquake. The earth shudders, waves ripple through rock, and thousands of miles away, the faintest tremor arrives in silence. For centuries, earthquakes were sudden terrors, unpredictable and mysterious. But by the late 19th century, scientists had developed seismographs capable of recording these events with remarkable clarity. At the heart of many designs was a suspended mass attached to a spring. When the ground shook, the frame of the instrument moved with it, but the mass, by inertia, lagged slightly behind. The spring stretched or compressed, and the difference was amplified into a trace on paper. It is a beautiful design, simplicity harnessed to reveal something vast. The spring does not know about tectonic plates or fault lines. It only knows Hooke's law: as it stretches, so the force. But in obeying that law, it becomes a messenger, translating the pulse of the planet into a line humans can read. Seismographs made earthquakes not just terrifying events, but measurable ones. They allowed scientists to detect tremors too faint for human senses, to calculate distances to epicenters, even to glimpse the layered structure of Earth itself. Without springs, we would know far less about the restless heart beneath our feet. Weighing scales offer another story of translation. Long before digital readouts, springs gave us a way to measure mass by elasticity. Place an object on a pan, and the spring beneath stretches. The amount of stretch is proportional to the weight. Instead of counterweights and balances, which required careful calibration, spring scales offered immediate readings. Farmers weighed produce, merchants measured goods, scientists recorded samples. all by relying on the uncomplaining honesty of a coil of metal. There is a quiet poetry in this too. The apple resting on a scale exerts a force invisible to the eye, but the spring reveals it by stretching just enough. The force of gravity, constant and unseen, becomes visible as a pointer moving across a dial. The spring does not judge the apple, it simply obeys nature, offering us a translation in numbers. Dynamometers extended this principle further, measuring forces in engineering, athletics, and medicine. A dynamometer might be used to test the strength of a bridge cable, the horsepower of an engine, or even the grip of a human hand. In each case, the principle is the same. A spring resists, and its deflection reveals the magnitude of the applied force. Engineers building locomotives could measure how much pull a machine produced. Doctors assessing rehabilitation could quantify a patient's recovery by the tension in a spring. Here again, the coil becomes a silent intermediary between the intangible and the tangible. What makes springs so useful as translators is their predictability. Within their elastic limit, they do not lie. Stretch them, compress them, twist them. They respond proportionally. That linearity is a gift to measurement. Imagine if springs responded erratically, sometimes stiff, sometimes yielding. They would be useless for science, but their obedience to Hooke's law makes them trustworthy scribes, recording invisible truths faithfully. Springs also played a role in early barometers and pressure gauges. While mercury columns measured air pressure by the weight of a liquid, aneroid barometers used a sealed metal capsule connected to springs. As air pressure changed, the capsule expanded or contracted, stretching springs that moved a needle. These devices were lighter, safer, and portable, making weather prediction more practical. Once again, the spring was at work, translating atmospheric whispers into information that sailors, farmers, and scientists could rely upon. Even the vibration of sound and machinery has been captured with springs. Accelerometers, used to measure motion and vibration, often rely on tiny masses suspended by springs. When a machine vibrates, the mass lags behind, stretching the spring in proportion to the acceleration. From that deflection, engineers can determine whether a bridge is swaying too much, whether an aircraft engine is running smoothly, whether a phone in your pocket is tilted. Modern micro-electromechanical systems, the tiny chips that let smartphones detect orientation, are filled with microscopic springs etched into silicon. You may not see them, but every time you rotate your phone and the screen turns with you, a spring is quietly doing its job. There is something deeply philosophical about this role of springs. They are mediators between worlds, the unseen and the seen, the abstract and the concrete. We cannot touch gravity directly, but we can watch it stretch a spring. We cannot hold air pressure in our hands, but we can see it move a needle. We cannot feel the faint shudder of a distant earthquake, but we can read it as a jagged line on paper. The spring is not the phenomenon itself, but it makes the phenomenon accessible. In this sense, springs are scientific translators. Just as language allows us to understand the thoughts of another mind, springs allow us to understand the forces of nature. They take something that would otherwise be hidden and render it in a form we can read, study, and trust. The coil of metal is not glamorous, but it is eloquent. Consider how this ability has shaped knowledge. Without seismographs, we would have struggled to understand plate tectonics, the shifting continents, the depths of Earth's mantle. Without spring scales, commerce would have been slower, science more cumbersome, medicine less precise. Without dynamometers and accelerometers, modern engineering would lack the feedback it depends on. Springs are not just parts of machines, they are parts of epistemology, the way humans come to know the world. There is a lovely irony here. Robert Hooke himself, the man who gave us the law of elasticity, also gave us the word cell when he looked through a microscope at cork. He was a man obsessed with finding the unseen. rendering it visible. His law made springs into instruments that carried that mission forward. Long after Hooke was gone, his principle continued to whisper, stretching and compressing, turning hidden forces into marks and numbers. It is easy to overlook this quiet service. When you step onto a bathroom scale in the morning, you may not think of it as a marvel of 17th century physics, but the spring beneath your feet is faithfully translating your interaction with gravity into a dial reading. When a scientist measures the force of a chemical reaction with a spring gauge, they are part of the same tradition that once measured the sway of bridges and the quiver of the earth. And yet, springs remind us of limits too. Just as in comfort, elasticity only holds within bounds. Overstretch a scale and it will give false readings. Push a seismograph spring too far and the trace will saturate. Translation is never infinite. Springs are honest within their domain, but outside it they falter. Scientists must design carefully to keep instruments within those faithful ranges. In that way, springs are also reminders of humility. They tell us, I can show you the world, but only up to a point. Today, even as digital sensors dominate, springs have not disappeared. Modern load cells, which measure forces electronically, are often based on strain gauges attached to elastic metal, effectively springs measured with finer tools. Even when invisible, the concept of elasticity remains at the heart of measurement. In laboratories, in industry, even in the phone in your hand, springs still serve as mediators between invisible forces and human understanding. If you pause for a moment, you might realize how extraordinary it is that so much of our knowledge rests on something so humble. A coiled wire, obeying a simple law, became the instrument by which earthquakes were studied, weights measured, engines tested, and skies predicted. The spring is not loud, but it speaks in numbers, and numbers are how we map the universe. Perhaps the deepest lesson is that the world is not only about power and spectacle. Sometimes it is about translation, about taking something inaccessible and making it known. Springs are translators not of words, but of forces. They are the quiet interpreters of gravity, pressure, vibration. They make the invisible visible, the intangible tangible. And in doing so, they remind us that understanding often comes not from what is grand, but from what is faithful. The next time you see a scale, or feel the soft vibration of a train beneath your feet, or watch the smooth tilt of your phone screen, consider the spring behind it. Hidden, coiled, reliable. Translating the world quietly into forms we can comprehend. When you look at the machines that built the modern world, you might imagine roaring engines, massive gears, or the thunder of pistons. But hidden behind that spectacle is a gentler companion, one that makes all the violence of motion survivable: the spring. It is easy to think of springs as small conveniences, tucked into pens or mattresses, but their true importance emerges in engineering. They are the quiet stabilizers of vehicles, the regulators of firearms, the cushions of cameras, the safety valves of factories. Without them, technology would be harsh, brittle, unforgiving. With them, it becomes smooth, stable, resilient. Vehicles provide perhaps the most immediate example. Long before the automobile, horse-drawn carriages struggled with the brutal reality of uneven roads. Wheels carried passengers directly over stones and ruts, every jolt transmitted to the wooden body. The answer was the leaf spring, long, thin strips of steel stacked together and bowed. As the carriage moved, the leaves flexed, absorbing shocks and redistributing force. The ride was still rough by modern standards, but the difference was profound. Suddenly, travel by carriage became less of a punishment and more of a possibility. When automobiles arrived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, suspension became even more crucial. As speeds increased, so did the violence of bumps. Coil springs replaced leaf springs in many designs, compressing and expanding with greater efficiency. They worked in partnership with shock absorbers, hydraulic devices that tamed the natural bounce of the spring, converting excess energy into heat. Without this duo, cars would bounce like pogo sticks, each bump sending passengers airborne. With them, the ride became smooth enough for long-distance travel. Some vehicles experimented with torsion bars, long steel rods that twist rather than bend. Compact and efficient, they turned rotational motion into elasticity, finding their way into tanks, trucks, and even sports cars. Each system, leaf, coil, torsion, is different in form, but all are variations on the same principle. Let the spring absorb what the body cannot. Every time you glide down a highway, you are gliding on Hooke's law, cushioned by steel that bends and returns. Firearms, too, rely on springs for function and safety. The recoil spring in a pistol absorbs the backward force of a shot, cycling the action smoothly. The firing pin spring ensures that the mechanism only strikes when intended, preventing accidental discharges. Magazines are powered by coiled springs, pushing rounds upward, feeding them with reliable pressure. Without springs, firearms would jam, misfire, or shake themselves apart. The spring does not provide the destructive force of the bullet, but it provides the stability that makes the weapon reliable. It is the silent partner, invisible beneath the casing, ensuring that each shot follows the last with precision. Photography, surprisingly, owes part of its early mechanics to springs as well. Before digital shutters, cameras relied on spring-driven mechanisms to snap open and closed at exact intervals. The energy stored in a coiled spring was released in a flash of precision, letting light strike the film for fractions of a second. In some cameras, even the film advance was powered by springs, wound up by a lever and unwinding to pull the celluloid strip forward. Each photograph captured was, in part, the gift of Hooke's law, a coil of steel metering time and motion with elegance. The Industrial Revolution amplified this principle across countless machines. Factories filled with looms, presses, and engines all demanded resilience. Springs appeared as governors, regulators, and safety valves. Steam engines, for instance, used springs to control pressure, preventing catastrophic explosions. In looms, springs maintained tension in threads, ensuring fabric was woven evenly. In countless small places, levers, latches, clutches, springs allowed machines to yield when necessary and recover immediately after. They were the guardians of precision in an age when precision became the foundation of productivity. Think of the sheer violence of industrial machinery. Iron pounding against iron, belts pulling with relentless force, gears grinding. Without elasticity, every impact would accumulate. Every stress would tear metal apart. Springs softened those blows, absorbed that stress, and gave machines endurance. They were not the stars of the Industrial Revolution, but they were the unsung chorus, allowing the music of machinery to play without breaking itself. In many cases, springs doubled as energy storage devices. The mainsprings of clocks and watches are the most famous examples, but the principle spread widely. Toys could be wound, storing energy for a cheerful march or a buzzing spin. Music boxes played their tunes because springs unwound steadily, driving tiny combs across metal teeth. Even industrial timers used coiled springs to release energy at predictable rates. Springs are modest batteries, storing energy mechanically instead of chemically. Wind them, and they wait patiently. Release them, and they give back exactly what they received. In the 20th century, springs expanded their reach into every form of technology. Automobiles perfected their suspensions. Airplanes used springs in landing gear, where shock absorption was a matter of life and death. Springs stabilized instruments, cushioned machinery, and provided reliable triggers for mechanisms from typewriters to telephones. They became so common so reliable that they vanished from our awareness. The world bounced softly on coils of steel, and hardly anyone noticed. And yet, the story does not end with steel coils visible to the eye. In the modern age, springs have shrunk, multiplied, and taken on new forms. Microsprings, etched into silicon, are at the heart of many electronics. In smartphones, accelerometers measure orientation by suspending tiny masses on springs. When you tilt your device, the masses shift, the springs deflect, and sensors translate that motion into data. The screen rotates, the game responds, the phone knows its place in space, all because of springs too small to see. Aerospace has its own reliance on springs. Satellite antennas often deploy by spring tension, coiled metal storing energy during launch, then releasing it in space to unfurl delicate arrays. Springs are perfect for this, lightweight, reliable, requiring no motors or power supply. In spacecraft, where failure is catastrophic, springs serve as quiet guarantees. Their simplicity is their strength. They cannot be hacked, shorted, or corrupted. They only know one thing: to return to form. Robotics, too, finds new uses for springs. Engineers design compliant actuators that incorporate springs to mimic the resilience of muscles. A robot leg with springs can absorb shock, balance naturally, and move with grace rather than rigidity. In prosthetics, spring-like materials return energy with each step, allowing amputees to walk and run with renewed ease. Once again, elasticity becomes not just a function but a metaphor, resilience embodied in metal and composite. It is remarkable to see how a principle first penned by Hooke in the 17th century now extends to silicon chips and robotic limbs. The same law governs a carriage jolting along a cobbled street and a satellite unfolding in orbit. The spring has no preference for scale. Whether it bends visibly in a truck's suspension or invisibly in a microchip, it obeys the same proportionality. That universality is part of its quiet power. If you look around, you may notice just how much stability springs provide. Every car ride, every airplane landing, every photograph captured, every phone rotation owes a debt to Hooke's law. The spring is never the star, never the showpiece, but it is always there, coiled in readiness, waiting to absorb, to stabilize, to return. There is something almost philosophical in the way springs handle violence. They do not resist absolutely like a brick wall, nor do they collapse entirely, like sand. They give and then recover. They absorb and then restore. They remind us that resilience is not about refusing to bend, but about bending wisely and then returning whole. Technology could not survive on rigidity alone. It needs the forgiving grace of elasticity. So the next time you ride in a car and feel only the gentle sway of motion rather than the brutal crack of pavement, think of the coils beneath you. The next time you set down your phone and watch its screen rotate smoothly, think of the micro-springs invisibly doing their work. The next time you see a rocket deploy its solar panels in orbit, know that a spring may have made it possible. These are not small things. They are the hidden pillars of our technological age. The history of engineering is not just the story of engines and power. It is also the story of moderation, of control, of balance. Springs gave humanity the ability to tame motion, to absorb force, to store energy, to stabilize. They allowed violence to be transformed into smoothness, chaos into order. They are the moderators of machines, the quiet partners in progress. And perhaps that is why they have endured. Springs are simple. A child can understand them. Yet they scale to the most complex machines humans have ever built. They embody the paradox of technology itself, at once humble and indispensable, modest and world-shaping. The spring is not loud, not flashy, not celebrated, but it holds the world together, one coil at a time. There is something deeply human about the way a spring behaves. Stretch it, and it yields. release it, and it returns. Not angrily, not with vengeance, but with proportion, with balance. It does not resist change absolutely, nor does it collapse under pressure. It accepts tension, stores it, and then restores itself. If resilience could be captured in metal, it would take the shape of a spring. We often imagine strength as rigidity, as the refusal to bend. But rigidity is brittle. A tree that will not sway in the wind will snap in the storm. A bridge with no give will shatter under strain. True endurance lies in elasticity, in the capacity to bend, to stretch, and then to find one's shape again. That is what springs teach us. They remind us that strength is not about denying forces, but about absorbing them wisely. There is also a lesson in balance. Springs live in the space between extremes, between slackness and stiffness, between collapse and defiance. They are defined by their equilibrium, the point to which they always return. In this way, they embody the very rhythm of existence: effort and rest, strain and release, tension and calm. Life, too, seems to move in these cycles. We work and we rest. We endure stress and we recover. To be human is to oscillate, not to remain fixed. Perhaps that is why the ticking of a balanced spring in a watch feels so intimate. It echoes the pulse of our own lives. Elasticity also defines the limits of our being. A spring will yield faithfully only up to a point. Beyond its elastic limit, it deforms, and its graceful proportionality is lost. People are much the same. We pride ourselves on resilience, but we are not infinite. We too have ranges within which we can adapt, stretch, recover. Beyond that, something gives way. The metaphor is sobering but also grounding. It reminds us to care for the balance, to recognize limits, to avoid mistaking resilience for invulnerability. The beauty of Hooke's law lies in its simplicity. As the extension, so the force, 4 words in Latin, ut tensio, sic vis. Yet those words underpin clocks, bridges, mattresses, seismographs, spacecraft. From a child's toy to a satellite orbiting Earth, the same principle holds. Out of simplicity comes complexity. Out of proportionality comes reliability. This is one of the quiet miracles of nature, that a law so small in expression can be so vast in consequence. It is tempting to dismiss springs as mundane. After all, they are everywhere. They hide in pens and chairs, in cars and watches. But that is precisely their poetry. They are unnoticed, yet essential. They remind us that the world is not held together only by grand theories or monumental inventions, but also by humble coils of metal obeying a quiet law. Their springiness is woven into our comfort, our technology, our measurement of the earth and sky. There is a gentle elegance in knowing that the same principle that governs the bounce of a mattress also governs the suspension of a spacecraft antenna in orbit. That the law guiding a child on a trampoline is the same law guiding an engineer calculating the sway of a skyscraper. This universality is comforting. It means that the fabric of the world is coherent, that the small and the great, the playful and the profound, obey the same rhythms. And perhaps most of all, springs remind us of return. Every stretch, every compression, every oscillation is a promise to come back to balance. In a world that often feels chaotic, where forces pull us in countless directions, that promise is soothing. To know that matter itself prefers equilibrium, that tension seeks release, that resilience is not the exception, but the rule. This is a quiet reassurance. So as you move through life, surrounded by springs you rarely notice, take a moment to see them not just as devices, but as metaphors. The pen that clicks, the mattress that yields, the car that glides. They are all whispering lessons of resilience, balance, and return. They are telling you, softly, that strength is not rigidity but elasticity, that beauty lies in proportion, that complexity can arise from simplicity. And maybe, in their silence, springs are offering us something else, an invitation to trust. Trust that the world has its balances, that tension will not last forever, that rest follows strain, that resilience is possible. Just as the spring holds the weight, bends, and then rises again, so too can we. In the end, Hooke's discovery was not only a law of mechanics, it was a window into the way the universe prefers to behave. Stretched, it responds. Released, it returns. Balanced between extremes, it holds its shape. The quiet power of springs is not only in what they do, but in what they symbolize, the deep resilience of matter, and perhaps of us. And so, as you listen, surrounded by the unnoticed springiness of your world, let yourself feel the calm of that truth. That hidden in your chair, your bed, your watch, your car, and your phone is a principle both humble and profound. That life, like a spring, bends, yields, and yet finds its way back. That simplicity, faithfully obeyed, holds up complexity. That resilience, quietly practiced, holds up the world. Thank you for listening. I hope these reflections on the quiet power of springs have given you something gentle to think about. A reminder of the resilience hidden in the world around us. Take your time now to rest, to let your own balance return. And when you're ready, may the steady rhythm of life carry you forward with the same quiet strength. Good night.